In this episode, I want to continue on with this concept of mythquakes, and particularly how we can measure them in order to be able to prepare interventions from an enterprise architecture perspective. Now, remember, a myth in this context is an untested or unverified assumption, something that we assume to be so. And a mythquake occurs whenever we have a conflict between that myth and reality. The analogy here is with an earthquake, hence mythquake. And remember that there are two quite different scales in earthquake models. There's the Richter scale, which measures the energy, and the Mercalli scale, which is more about impact. For any given earthquake, there's a single level of energy, but an infinite range of impacts. Now, for this, I'm looking really at a Mythquake scale that's more about impact, in terms of particularly its impact on lives. So, a Mythquake 0, we've got a 10-level scale. A Mythquake 0 is our everyday upsets that happen all the time, continuously, all through the day. Every time we have a little conflict, that should have worked, that didn't work, what's wrong? That's a very simple first level mythquake. A mythquake 1 is where it starts to have real effect on people's lives. So for example, every minute of every day, around 200 people will meet up with a mythquake around the myth of I gotta live forever, and then discover that they don't. A Mythquake 2 particularly is relates to what we might call the terrible twos. It's particularly around that I am the centre of the world. The relationship between I versus other produces all manner of mythquakes that can be quite lethal when they're in a medium scale environment. So we can put that up at Mythquake 2, affecting up to 100 lives. Mythquake 3 is the world of work. I am what I do. When what I do ceases to exist, it's like an existential problem. If I cease to do the work that I was doing, if I lose my job, I no longer exist. Now this, when a company closes, this can affect thousands of people. That's a Mythquake 3. A Mythquake 4, affecting 10,000 people or more, is typical mainstream politics. Whoever you voted for, the government got in. That's the kind of feel where a government policy is going to affect thousands of lives, sometimes tens of thousands. Removing people's ability to live, removing this, that and the other, happens at a larger scale than a single company, and can affect tens of thousands of lives at a time. At a Mythquake 5 level, one of the examples I use here is the whole money system. The way that our economics is based on assumptions about how people interact, about how some people should trade. This can, a fairly minor matter, can affect 100,000 lives. An economic crash, for example, because of failed assumptions about money, can easily affect hundreds of thousands of lives. At a Mythquake 6 level, it's more about what people believe to be true. We see things like meaning, about religion, about beliefs about science, beliefs that are larger scope than just politics, but are, again, existential assumptions, which, when challenged, can affect literally millions of lives. At the next level up, we're talking about the whole I am who I am, and particularly when someone else decides that you should not be or should not exist because of what you are. Things of which you have no choice at all, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnic group, social class of birth. All of these things of which you have no control. These can easily affect tens upon tens of millions of lives, particularly when we see things like a religious war break out, or when we get racial attacks on a particular group. The next one is Mythquake 8. We're up in the tens of millions of lives range here. Is ideas that are fundamental but actually don't work. Now, one of them for me is the concept of rights. Rights are a kind of assumption that is often not so much about rights but about the evasion of responsibility and causes things to fail. Now, this can be up in huge levels, particularly when we start looking at our responsibilities in relation to the world in which we live. And for me, a Mythquake 9, which is running right up against extinction levels, kind of levels of worry, are the whole myth around the idea of possession, that I possess, that it's all about me. So that's a scale we can use to measure and identify the types of interactions that occur, the types of risks that are involved, and also why this is so darned important, because practicing on the small mythquakes allows us to work on the big ones. From an enterprise architecture perspective, this scale, we mostly deal with, in enterprise architecture, we mostly deal with issues that are at most around Mythquake 4, around the world of work and the world of politics. But some are heading right up into Mythquake 7 with the whole issues around diversity. And the social media the whole social milieu in which we live is heading very fast towards some very real Mythquake 9 level Mythquakes. We need to face with these. We need to start tackling them, and we need the tools to do it. That's why this is important.